The Bible says that the flood destroyed all flesh on the earth, but there is a word that theologians avoid analyzing. In the original Hebrew, Genesis 6 uses the expression kolbasar, which means all flesh that moves upon the earth. On the land, not under the deep waters, and that difference changes absolutely everything we think we know. The divine judgment had a precise geographical limit, and something or someone knew it before it started to rain. Plato described an advanced and corrupt civilization that was sunk into the ocean as divine punishment millennia ago. That civilization was called Atlantis, and its destruction was not by flames, but by the waters of the deep sea. But Atlantis was not destroyed by water. Rather, it sank into the water, and that distinction is crucial. Not all of its inhabitants died on solid ground, because many were already in the ocean when the judgment arrived. What if Atlantis was not just a simple Greek legend, but the cultural memory of the antediluvian world, of the Nephilim? The same event seen from two different traditions, the Bible and Plato, points exactly towards the same disaster. However, the most disturbing thing is not the destruction of Atlantis, but what survived after it. Because on the shores of the Mediterranean, centuries after the flood, a god emerged who came directly from the sea. His name was Dagon, and the Philistines worshipped him with a fervor that no military defeat could ever extinguish. The Bible mentions it in the first book of Samuel, chapter 5, when the Ark of the Covenant is brought to Ashdod. The Temple of Dagon was precisely in Ashdod, a coastal city of Canaan, a land of giants par excellence. Dagon was depicted with a human torso and a fish tail, a hybrid being between the terrestrial world and the marine world. But Dagon was not the only being like that in the memory of ancient humanity, and that makes everything even stranger. In ancient Mesopotamia, there was a figure called Oannes, described in Sumerian texts with absolute precision. Oannes was a being half man and half fish who emerged from the sea every day to teach humans civilization. They taught them agriculture, writing, architecture, laws, and every night he returned to the depths of the dark ocean. Dagon in Canaan, Ons in Babylon, the founders of Atlantis, according to Plato, all sons of the sea god Poseidon. Three figures in three cultures that never had direct contact, all converging on the exact same archetype. Divine beings linked to water who emerge from the sea to teach civilization to an inferior and forgetful humanity. This is not mythological coincidence. It is the same historical memory preserved by cultures separated by thousands of kilometers. However, to understand why Dagon appeared precisely in the land of giants, we need to return to the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch details how the Watchers, the fallen angels, took human women as companions. From that forbidden union were born the Nephilim, giants of hybrid flesh who corrupted all life on Earth. But before analyzing the survival theories, we must understand exactly who the Watchers were. The Watchers were not lesser demons, but high-ranking angels with defined cosmic functions since creation. His decision to descend was voluntary, calculated, and represented the greatest angelic rebellion before the end of the world. The Book of Enoch names 200 Watchers who descended on Mount Hermon and sealed a pact among themselves. That pact included sharing with humans forbidden knowledge, celestial technology, and reproductive abilities. The result was not only physical giants, but a civilization that in just a few centuries surpassed all normal human limits. That antediluvian civilization built structures that we now call impossible without a convincing technological explanation. The traditions of all ancient cultures recall a golden age prior to the Great Flood that erased everything. An age when men and gods coexisted, when knowledge flowed freely between heaven and earth. But that age ended with catastrophic violence, and the memories of its end were preserved in universal myths. The Sumerian flood, the Babylonian flood of Utnapishtim, the Hindu flood of Manu, all essentially tell the same story. When the flood came, the bodies of the Nephilim were destroyed in the wars they themselves unleashed. Their souls, according to Enoch, became unclean spirits that wander the earth seeking bodies to inhabit. But there is a question that the text does not answer directly, and that modern researchers are beginning to ask. What happened to the Nephilim that had already mutated, that had already adapted to the marine environment before the flood? If the genetic corruption of the Watchers began centuries before the flood, there was enough time for adaptation. There was time for some descendants of the Watchers to develop traits that made them viable underwater. The flood purified the earth with surgical precision, but the depths of the ocean were never part of the judgment. And then, when the waters receded, something that had survived in the depths began to rise slowly. This would explain why, after the flood, the Bible mentions giants again as if nothing had really happened. Genesis 10 and Numbers 13 mention the Anakites, the Rephaim, the Emim, and the Zamzummim in the land of Canaan. Where did these post-diluvian giants come from if the flood had eliminated all corrupted flesh from the earth? The official response states that corruption returned through the ark, hidden in the genealogy of Ham or his wives. But there is a second theory that fits perfectly with biblical geography, and that very few dare to consider. The post-diluvian giants systematically appear on the coasts, in the ports, and in the cities by the sea. The Philistines, a people of the sea by historical definition, carried the most concentrated Nephilim genetics in the entire region. Goliath was a Philistine, and Goliath was over 2 meters 90 according to the literal description of the original Hebrew text. His brothers were also giants, and they all lived on the same Mediterranean coast where Dagon was worshipped. The Nephilim genetics did not return from within the earth, but literally emerged from the depths of the sea. However, the story of the coastal giants is just one part of the mystery that the flood left unresolved. There is also another category of hybrid beings that appears in cultures around the world with disturbing consistency. We call them mermaids, but that modern name trivializes what ancient sources described with genuine terror. They were not beautiful singers on the rocks. They were creatures of supernatural origin with specific physical characteristics. In the Apocryphal Hebrew tradition, there are references to women who were transformed into water creatures as punishment. Women who voluntarily joined the Watchers, or who were taken by force and paid an eternal price. Her transformation was not only physical but ontological, a change in the very nature of her being and her ultimate destiny. But here arises the question that generates the most debate among researchers of ancient texts and biblical traditions. Was that transformation a divine punishment? Or was it actually a way to escape the inevitably approaching judgment? If the women carrying the DNA of the Watchers were transformed before the flood, they survived the flood. Not as rebels who evaded judgment, but as beings whose nature was no longer entirely earthly flesh. Ancient Mesopotamia knew Mami Wata, a female spirit who is half woman and half fish, revered throughout Africa. There is no documented historical contact between the apocryphal Hebrew traditions and the African traditions of Mami Wata. However, Both describe exactly the same being, a woman of divine or cursed origin linked to the deep water. The Greeks had the Nereids, the Oceanids, the Sirens of Homer, all female creatures of the marine world. Homer did not write fantasy. He wrote about what Greek sailors remembered having found in the real sea. In medieval Europe, the figure of Melusina appears in chivalric texts as a woman with a serpent or fishtail. Melusina appears in the heraldry of European noble families, in illuminated manuscripts, and on the capitals of Gothic cathedrals. And finally, that same two-tailed mermaid figure was adopted as the logo by the largest coffee chain in the world. From the texts of Enoch to the coffee cups of the 21st century, the same creature survives in memory. Cultures in Africa, Asia, Europe, and pre-Columbian America all preserve the image of a hybrid woman connected to the sea. This cannot be explained by cultural diffusion because the temporal and geographical separations make contact impossible. The only coherent explanation is that these traditions preserve the memory of something that really existed before. But let's return to the central problem that the biblical text presents, and that no theological commentary satisfactorily resolves. If the flood eliminated all genetic corruption from the earth, why do the giants reappear so quickly afterwards? There are three main theories that researchers of apocryphal texts and ancient traditions have rigorously developed. The first theory is known as the Ark theory, and it holds that corruption traveled aboard with Noah's family. A god warns a righteous man, commands him to build a vessel, and corrupt humanity perishes in the waters. The consistency of this account across unrelated cultures is a strong piece of evidence for its historicity. It is not parallel mythology by coincidence. It is the preservation of a real event from different cultural perspectives. And in all those traditions, there is always something that survives in the water, something that the flood cannot completely erase. In the Babylonian tale, sea creatures assist the hero, suggesting previous alliances between humans and aquatic beings. These pre-existing alliances would explain why some human lineages had special connections to the marine world. Links that were later expressed in coastal cults, in sea gods, in dynasties that claimed aquatic origins. The first Egyptian dynasties claimed to descend from gods who came from the river and the sea, not from the dry land. The Phoenicians, the most advanced navigators of the ancient Mediterranean, preserved mysteries related to the ocean. Their gods included aquatic figures with a dual nature, both terrestrial and marine simultaneously, like Dagon himself. This suggests that the cultural network preserving the memory of the marine lineage was more extensive than it appears in the texts. According to this interpretation, Cam's wife, or one of Noah's daughters-in-law, carried the Nephilim lineage in her blood. The flood purified the earth geologically, but it could not purify the DNA that was already inside the saving vessel. This would explain the speed with which the giants reappear in Canaan after the establishment of new nations. The second theory has the strongest geographical evidence and directly links Dagon with the Philistines. It is called the marine theory, and it proposes that water-adapted Nephilim survived in the actual ocean depths. When the land was repopulated, these creatures gradually began to interact with the humans of the coasts. The genetic reintegration occurred on the shores of the Mediterranean, exactly where the Bible places the giants. The Philistines, as a sea people, would be the clearest evidence of this reintegration between the human and the hybrid marine. Dagon would not be an invented god, but rather the cultural memory of a real ancestor who literally emerged from the depths of the sea. The third theory works with the spiritual framework that the Book of Enoch itself establishes explicitly and in detail. The souls of the Nephilim, turned into unclean spirits, continued to operate in the physical world after the flood. These spirits would have biologically influenced post-Diluvian generations from an invisible dimension. Corruption was not genetic in the strict sense, but spiritual. Yet it produced physical effects in the lineages. The giants of Canaan did not inherit Nephilim DNA directly, but were shaped by external influences. None of the three theories mutually exclude each other, and the textual evidence supports elements of all three simultaneously. But Atlantis adds a fourth interpretative key that completely transforms the way of reading the post-Diluvian text. If Atlantis was the central Nephilim civilization, its sinking was not separate from the flood, but part of it. The same judgment that brought rain upon the earth also sank the great island of the giants to the bottom of the sea. The survivors of Atlantis did not flee to distant lands, because there was no safe land in any possible direction. They fled downwards, into the depths, to the only realm where divine judgment had no direct jurisdiction. And centuries later, when the memory of the flood began to fade, the descendants of those survivors emerged. They arrived on the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean shores, bringing knowledge, power, and diverse genetics. The sea peoples that archaeologists record in Egyptian texts from the 2nd millennium BC, who were they? The Egyptians described them as warriors of unknown origin who arrived from the sea with inexplicable technology. Among those sea peoples were precisely the Philistines, the bearers of the lineage of Dagon, and the giants. Not only the Philistines, but multiple coastal peoples of the Mediterranean kept fragments of that ancient memory. And all of them disappeared or were absorbed, leaving only those fragments as traces of what they once knew. The systematic destruction of these coastal towns by Israel was not just ordinary territorial conquest. It was the continuation of the same cosmic conflict that began when the Watchers descended to Mount Hermon first. Each battle of Joshua against the giants of Canaan was an episode of that war which the flood had not finished. And each destroyed coastal city was one more node in the network that preserved the knowledge of the ancient marine lineage. However, the network was never completely destroyed because the knowledge it held was too profound, too deep to be erased by bronze swords, by fire, by time, or by collective forgetfulness. It survived in symbols, in rituals, in city names, in constellations, in the very texts that condemn it. Because even the Bible, when naming Dagon, when describing the giants, when mentioning the sea as something unjudged, it involuntarily preserves the evidence of the reality it tries to refute. And that is the most fascinating paradox of all. The text that condemns the marine lineage is also the text that most clearly demonstrates that this lineage truly existed. And it existed with enough strength for the God of Genesis to consider the greatest judgment in human history necessary. This is not speculation. It is the convergence of biblical, apocryphal, archaeological, and mythological evidence at one point. A point that the official history prefers to keep fragmented so that the complete picture formed by the data is never seen. However, there is an aspect of the mystery of Dagon that almost no researcher has pointed out with sufficient clarity. The Temple of Dagon in Ashdod was the place where the Philistines placed the Ark of the Covenant after capturing it in battle. They placed the most sacred object of the Hebrew people at the feet of a statue of a fish-tailed god, and it was not accidental. It was a conscious theological statement claiming that the sea's genetics was superior to the earth's God's covenant. The next day, the statue of Dagon was fallen with its face to the ground before the ark, according to the text of Samuel. On the second day, the statue had fallen again, and this time its head and hands were cut off at the threshold. The biblical text describes a cosmic confrontation between two lineages, the terrestrial and the marine, and one emerged victorious. But that defeat did not mean the end of the cult, because the Philistines continued to worship Dagon for centuries more. The marine lineage had a resilience that the terrestrial lineage could not extinguish through normal military force. And that resilience is what we would expect from a lineage that had already survived the greatest cataclysm in history. A lineage that had survived the flood in the depths has a different relationship with extinction and defeat, because for them, extinction had already happened once, and they had overcome it by adapting to what no one else could endure. Let's return to the question that most unsettles theologians who are well acquainted with the apocryphal texts and their implications. Did the flood fail in its central objective, which was to eliminate all the genetic corruption of the watchers of creation? The literal answer from the biblical text is no, because God declared that his purpose was fulfilled after the flood. But the re-emergence of the giants and the persistence of the cults of Dagon suggests something much more complex. Perhaps the flood did not fail, but rather its jurisdiction was precisely the earth, and that was exactly what God judged. The sea was not judged because the sea was not the domain of man. It was the domain of something completely different and ancient. And what inhabited that ancient domain before the flood continued to inhabit it afterward, with total theological impunity. This raises a question that biblical eschatology does answer, although not in the book of Genesis, but in Revelation. The Apocalypse, chapter 13, describes a beast that rises from the sea with features that closely resemble Dagon. It has parts of leopard, bear, lion, and the dragon gives it its power, its throne, and its authority over all the inhabited earth. Is it possible that the Apocalypse is describing the return of the marine lineage that survived the flood in the depths? Will the judgment that could not be completed with water at the beginning be completed with fire at the end of times? These questions do not have definitive answers in the texts, but their internal coherence is absolutely disturbing. The narrative from Genesis to Revelation suggests a cosmic war between two lineages of completely different origins. The earthly lineage, created from dust by the God of Genesis, and the marine lineage of corrupt, angelic, and aquatic origin. And we, the post-Diluvian humanity, live in the territory where that war has never really ended at all. Every time we look at the sea and feel that inexplicable mix of attraction and terror, something ancient in us remembers it. We remember, even if we don't know exactly what we remember, that the ocean was never just water, salt, and ordinary biological life. The ocean was, and perhaps still is, the refuge of something that the greatest judgment in history failed to reach. Dagon continues to be worshipped, not in stone temples, but in the symbols we carry with us unknowingly every day. The two-tailed mermaid in your morning coffee cup is the same creature that terrorized sailors of the Mediterranean. It is the same figure that the Philistines placed before the Ark of the Covenant as a declaration of supremacy over Israel. It is the same memory that Plato preserved in the myth of Atlantis, which Homer described in the rocks of the Strait of Messina. It is the same figure as Oannes in Babylon, Mami-Wata in Africa, and Melusina in the medieval castles of Europe. They are all fragments of the same memory that humanity cannot forget, because something inside knows it is real. The flood was the judgment upon the earth, complete in its dominion, just as God declared it would be from the beginning. But the sea was never judged, and what survived in the sea has been preparing for its return to the land for millennia. The question isn't if it happened. The textual and cultural evidence strongly suggests it did, with hard-to-ignore consistency. The real question is what it means for the present, for the world we live in, for the symbols we accept. Because if the lineage of Dagon survived, it gradually reintegrated with humanity through all the coasts. So, the corruption that God tried to eradicate was not eliminated, but diluted and integrated into the human fabric. And the giants of Canaan that Joshua faced were not a historical anomaly, but the visible tip of something much deeper. Something that continued after the conquest of Canaan, after the fall of the Philistines, after the end of the Bronze Age. Something that did not disappear with Goliath, nor with the temples of Dagon, nor with the destruction of Ashdod by the Hebrew armies. Something that found new forms, new symbols, new cults, new coastal cities for its millenary presence. The story of the flood has a chapter that was deliberately omitted from all known official versions. That chapter is called The Kingdom of Dagon, and its consequences did not end in biblical times, but continue to this day. Today you learn the truth that the apocryphal texts, comparative mythology, and biblical geography reveal when read together. The flood had a limit, something survived in the sea, and that something left traces in the coastal cultures of the world. If you want to keep discovering these mysteries, don't miss the upcoming videos, each one more revealing than the last. Subscribe now and activate the bell so you don't miss the upcoming videos where we will explore these biblical secrets.